Hello and welcome to the Wholeman Mission podcast. This week I'm alone. It's the first one I've done on my own since the very first one. And there's a few reasons for it, really. So I do like writing as well, as much as I do like spreading the word through video and these podcasts and stuff around men's mental health and men's positive well-being. And recently I wrote a piece around grief. Now I believe that men do struggle with that subject of grief, because I know firsthand myself and what grief did to me and does to me, and how I struggle sometimes. Now, for the audience that are listening to this, if you have lost anybody that's close to you before, you'll know the pain and the sorrow that it brings with it. I like a quote, which I don't know who said it, but the cost of love is the pain of grief. And I think that's very much so when we do lose those close to us. I think my most intense journey with grief was when my dad died, and he died 2017, so 7 years ago this year. And a lot was going on in my life around the time that he did die. I'd left the Navy, we'd had a traumatic birth with my little girl Poppy. My first ever business idea was in the toilet, basically, because it didn't quite take off, and I couldn't provide for the family at the time. So there's a lot of things going on around the same time that my dad was diagnosed with cancer, and it made me think a lot, because I didn't have the best relationship with my dad. I'm very open about that. When we were younger, I always wanted him to be there more than he was. I wanted him to see me, which I didn't think he did. And it was a very strange relationship, really, looking back. And I'm sure lots of dads and sons probably have the same journey as what my dad and I had. But what it left, so my dad was a bit of an infamous guy in Hull. So a lot of people knew my dad sometimes for the wrong reasons. He worked the doors, he worked on the docks, he did all sorts really with regards to getting his hands dirty and working. And he had a lot of respect when he was in the boozer. A lot of the blokes would respect him because he's a big hard guy. But as I grew older, I tried to sort of walk in his footsteps, kind of, and realised that actually that's not necessarily the right way to live your life. Not if you want to stay out of prison anyways. But anyways, I started to assess and reflect on why our relationship was so fractured. And when he was diagnosed with cancer, I wanted to become closer to him because he was dying, and I didn't want him to die without knowing that I did actually love him, and for our ups and downs and our relationship that we had, I did love him, and I wanted him to know that. But I struggled letting go of my judgment around his behaviour whilst I was growing up. Because one, I judged his relationship with my mum and how that was fractured. They ended up divorcing, and he ended up remarrying another lady who actually ended up being the love of his life, and she was a beautiful woman, and she is a beautiful woman. She's still around. But I couldn't keep getting over the amount of the times he'd let me and my sister down. And there was a time where my sister I'd just passed out a PT course in the Royal Navy, and my sister she came out and told the family that she was gay. And around the same time, she also said that she was an addict of hard drugs. And the family didn't really understand that. They didn't know what to do. My dad, as always, didn't really know where to put himself. And my mum certainly didn't know what to do as well. So I ended up going and getting my sister and bringing her down to Plymouth where I was living, and she lived with me. But again, that drove a distance between my dad and I, and even my mum as well, because I was filled with resentment, really, because I kept on thinking, well, why am I doing this? I'm not the parent, I'm the son. So there was lots of events around my life where I ended up carrying all this anger, really. I didn't know how to get rid of it. I wanted to move on because if dad has just been diagnosed with cancer, I can't hold on to that because I need to get back on track of him so that he can die in peace. I know that's what I wanted for him to do. I wanted him to die in peace and die knowing that I loved him regardless of our relationship and regardless of my judgment of his behaviour. And at the time I was working in a place called Marchwood, which is an army camp. And basically the lady I was working with, the physio I was working with, she was a Christian, a very strong believer, or a follower of faith, Jesus Christ. And at the time, I was not in a place to accept that. And I'd always explored my spirituality. So I meditated before, researched into Buddhism and all these sort of other concepts of developing our spirituality. And this lady wouldn't engage in a conversation with me around these subjects until I've read the Bible and understood where she was coming from with her beliefs. And at the time, obviously, I had this anger and I wanted to forgive my dad. So it coincided with the fact that I was working with this lady who was lived their life a moral compass was always pointing in the right direction most of the time, I think, as much as I know. And I wanted to learn to forgive my dad. So I just started listening to the Bible. So driving from Portsmouth to Southampton every day was about an hour there and an hour back, depending on the traffic. And then within 4 weeks, I started to understand how powerful the Bible was to me and how the lessons of forgiveness was written in the scripture. And that basically the whole concept around scripture was about loving and forgiving. And obviously this is a conversation that is very personal to me. I'm not sort of going out there and sort of saying anything really other than telling you my own journey to forgiving my dad and learning to live with grief, because this is what I wanted to do today. I didn't have the bottle to ask anyone to come on this one and talk about grief because grief is very personal, and certainly for fellas to talk about grief, it's difficult. So I didn't want to sort of make anyone feel uncomfortable coming on here and talking about it without them being in a good place to talk about it. So I thought I'll just come on and talk about it myself. So I'm talking about my grief and how I sort of I've led to deal with it. So when I come to this place and I started to become more forgiving, and it's, by the way, it's a constant journey. I still have bouts of anger. I still have bouts of guilt, shame, more guilt than anything else, because I feel guilty because I held on for it for so long and didn't let go of it. And that did drive a massive distance between my dad and I for such a long time. And the back end of his life, we became probably the closest we ever were, to be fair, because I was a dad and I knew that it wasn't straightforward. I was a partner and about to become a husband, and I knew that wasn't straightforward. So I started to reflect on all these judgments I made on my dad about his relationships and about how he was being a dad, and actually started to sort of go, well, actually, I haven't got it all together myself, to be fair. And as time has gone on, 7 years on, which I would love to have a conversation with my dad these days and talk about the fact that sometimes I'm making the same mistake. So one thing I don't talk about a lot, but it does play my mind, is the fact that even though my dad was always in the boozer or under Her Majesty's care at the time, we had the Queen at the time, so he'd be boozer, prison, work. Didn't really see him a lot at home, if I'm honest. Although I'm not a boozer, I am probably considered, people that know me would probably say I was a workaholic. I do wrap myself up in work most of the time because I feel that it's very purposeful and I'm driven towards helping people, as you probably noticed. That's something that I have a desire to do. It's to inspire people to look after themselves, to find benefits in moving their bodies more and more often. But sometimes I do think that I cross the line between work and being a workaholic. And when I do go through trauma, or I am feeling not quite on top of my game mentally, I do throw myself into more projects. And admittedly, sometimes that's paid off, sometimes it's not, and I've ended up spinning too many plates and dropped one or two. And one of those plates might be family life. I mean, at the minute, I'm going through a period of growth with regards to business. So it does take a lot of my time, but I do feel like I've got a bit of, I don't like to say the word balance, because I think when you are driven, balance is non-existent. That's my opinion. You can argue with me on that, but that's my opinion. I think when you're driven towards a purpose, or you're driven towards growth in certainly in business, I think sometimes there are sacrifices. But at the minute, I feel like I'm getting things pretty right with family life. But like I said, I think I do cross the line at times where I reflect back and think, although my dad's wasn't that healthy, his absence wasn't healthy, and the fact that he was always in the booze and stuff like that, I'm always in the gym or out presenting or up in the big smoke doing networking and stuff. So looking back now and dealing with my grief and becoming more forgiving and learning to become more forgiving through the power of scripture, I think that's really helped me manage grief. Also, as well, physical activity. So I often find when I am having bouts of significant grief where I really do miss my dad. Like a few years ago, we had my Uncle John, who's his brother, who basically they literally look identical, and a lot of the time they was associated together. They do the doors together, they work together. So when my Uncle John died a few years ago, it was like reliving that whole process again. And to be fair, even their funerals were all the same guys telling the same stories about incidents where they'd been in trouble in town for scrapping and all these sort of things. So it was a tough time, that, because although I don't think that I was mega close with my Uncle John, it was my Uncle John and he was my dad's brother, and there were so many similarities. So it was just bringing everything back up. And then around that time, I just threw myself into exercise, really. and that's why I always think to myself when I'm going through bouts of extreme exercise where I'm really putting myself in the hurt locker, it's more often because I'm dealing with stuff, and I'd sooner rather do that than booze, because booze for me is definitely a no-go, as I'm not confident of where my behaviour goes when I do booze. And I thought I'd just talk about grief really on this one. Like I said, I didn't really want to talk to anybody specifically on here with me because, one, it's a very personal experience and we all react differently to grief. And different coping mechanisms, some are more healthier than others. Like I know when my dad died, my sister lapsed and she became heavily addicted to a substance called spice. Ended up going in prison, ended up serving 4.5 years. And that was her coping mechanism. Around the same time, my coping mechanism for the first few months was to just eat. And I managed to get myself so out of shape because I didn't have the desire to look after myself. And I don't know if you've dealt with grief, but it's so strange. It can take the wind out of your sails and you could be the most motivated guy or girl in the world, but once that hits you, sometimes you're just literally flat. And because I carried so many different emotions around it, about being shameful and guilty around not forgiving my dad, it just knocked me for six. And then I think what happened was the more I started to delve deeper into my faith, the more my heart started to heal. And I actually started to take a little bit more charge of myself again with regards to physical activity, eating better, walking lots more, getting my head in a better place. And then I ended up actually starting a dad's community. So I always wanted to set up a charity based around grief, really. And that because I felt like that was one of the most powerful things I've ever been through, and I thought that like lads must go through the same emotions and not talk about it or deal with it. And then, anyways, I ended up putting out there about dad's fitness, and I ended up starting this dad's community called the Super You Project. And I looking back now, that would have been much better being set up as a charity. But at the time, I didn't have much work, so I thought, I need to look after my family and myself first. So I set it up as a business, and it was really, really successful for quite some time. And I ended up writing a book, which also helped me cope with grief. The writing became so cathartic, and I was actually talking a lot more on video as well. So I was doing like walking down the seafront, doing talk to camera, and talking about all sorts really. But I found that it was all part of that healing as well. I know I've been a little bit disjointed probably here where I've been talking about grief and I've jumped from one subject to the other, but what the fundamental message around this podcast, and if you are listening, is grief is something personal. We don't know how it's going to affect us. We certainly need, in my opinion, to talk about those people that we have lost. And also on this as well, like I don't necessarily think that grief only happens when we lose somebody. I think it can happen when we lose something, and sometimes we might grieve over a business idea that's gone to, or business opportunity that's gone in the toilet, or something. Or I think sometimes when we split up with somebody as well, I think that could possibly bring up the similar emotions. But I mean, losing somebody so close to you, like a parent, and I always think to myself, like, I wonder if that's the same regardless of your relationship. So say, for instance, you haven't seen your parent, or you haven't spoken to your parent for years, and they die, I wonder if there's some spirit at a spiritual level, and I know I'm talking a little bit woo-hoo here, but whether that part of you still mourns and is still grieves, because that essentially that's that person that brought us, that was part of bringing us into this world. Yeah. So that's my discussion on grief, and that's how I deal with it. I write, I talk, I do exercise, and I do my best to help as many geezers or many people as possible to help them possibly deal with stuff like that themselves through the power of fitness. So that's the Wholeman Mission for this week. Thank you for listening.